On behalf of the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Centre, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Paris Agreement in 2021. I'm Adam Fremeth and the E.J. Kernahan Chair in Energy Policy at Ivey, and will be moderating the discussion here today. The past week has demonstrated a renewed interest in multilateral negotiations with meetings at both the G7 and NATO, some bilateral conversations that are going on over in Europe that didn't seem to be happening for about 4.5 years now, I think almost. And so it'll be very interesting to have the two great panelists that we have with us today to bring their many years of experience on the international climate negotiation process, and who both come from very different backgrounds on the topic. First, we'll have Professor Radoslav Dimitrov, who is not only a faculty member in the political science department here at Western, but has also served on the European Union delegation at the United Nations climate negotiations since 2009. Rado participated in negotiating the Paris Agreement and made statements at the ministerial level meetings during that conference. Rado will be presenting his recent policy brief that has been published through the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Centre and was made available to all of you as you registered for this session. After that, we'll have Gordon Lambert speaking and making remarks on Rado's presentation. Gordon has had over 40 years of experience in Canada's energy sector and was most recently the CEO of the Alberta Energy Regulator. Prior to that, Gordon had an esteemed career at Suncor, where he had served as the VP of Sustainability, and in that role had participated in the United Nations climate negotiations process. Gord is the Suncor Sustainability Executive in Residence at our Energy Centre, and will be offering those comments on a more of a corporate perspective following Rado's presentation. We'll open to Q&A after that, and we'll be taking questions through the Zoom Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to pass along questions during the presentation, during Gord's comments, and following, and we'll collect those and pose those to the panelists. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Dimitrov to hear about the Paris Agreement in 2021. Rado, you are muted.
Thank you, Adam. It's a wonderful opportunity to have this event and engage in a conversation regarding what I perceive to be one of the most transformative socio-political processes that are shaping human societies today. What I would like to do is discuss today 3 topics, all of which pertain to what could be described as the early stages of a global transition to a clean economy. The Paris Agreement is one of the drivers of this process, and I would like to spend some time giving people a sense of this treaty and its status when it comes to implementation. Particularly important are the government policies that have been launched abroad and that are now accelerating. And in addition to the government realm, we need to pay attention to the global economic and financial trends in the private sectors. These are not necessarily related to one another, but they certainly suggest that there is a common trend in the same direction. What I'd like to emphasize is that some of my comments today are very much informed by my participation in the climate talks for nearly 17 years, including serving on the European delegation and being a very active participant. I also had the opportunity to work with the European Union on designing their negotiating strategy, and I co-chaired the European Union Task Force on Climate Communication. And so I'd really like to share my observations and my experience with the EU in particular, because there are certain things happening in the kitchen of climate diplomacy as well as domestic policy making that are sometimes amiss to the general public. First of all, the Paris Agreement is one of the most complex treaties in international law that have been negotiated recently. You have to understand that it comes in the wake of many, many years of repeated failures that have made climate diplomacy notorious for its hopelessness. The key provisions of the treaty are essentially a result of an incredibly complicated compromise between the major players that had been at each other's throat for so many years on all of the key issues. First of all, the treaty stipulates mandatory national plans for emission reductions, called also NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. Every country that joins the treaty and ratifies it must develop a domestic policy plan. At the same time, however, the content of this plan is left at the complete discretion of national governments. What is feasible to do domestically, how quickly, using what policy instruments, that is entirely to each country to decide for itself. Now, that was negotiated into the treaty in order to reassure governments who were skeptical of climate policy and to essentially invite them in. But in a sense, the treaty is a trap, because the European Union, as well as the island nations, fought very, very hard in Paris and the years before that to introduce provisions in the treaty that relate to progression. Most commonly, it's known as the ratcheting up mechanism. And what that really means is that once a country develops a national plan and announces it, it is under legal obligation every 5 years to update that plan. Not just in any way, but every consecutive domestic pledge has to be more ambitious than the previous one. And what that really is intended to do is to lock countries into a long-term process of policy acceleration. The treaty has evolved since 2015. There were additional things that were negotiated, including a rule book for implementation that has added, among a number of things, strong accountability and transparency provisions to the treaty. The only major issue that has not been completed yet is in Article 6, which pertains to international emissions trading. Complete failure so far to finalize that article, and as a result of that, there is no progress on global carbon markets or global carbon price, which is essential for emissions trading. That is the one major gap that remains. How much does the Paris Agreement matter? There are different ways to measure that. In political science, we have legalistic measures, behavioral measures, and environmental measures. From a legal point of view, and also a political point of view, it's notable that the Paris Agreement enjoys virtually universal political support among governments. Every single country has actually not only signed, but also ratified the treaty, except Eritrea, Iraq, Iran, Libya, South Sudan, Turkey, and Yemen. Those 7 or so countries account for 4% of global emissions, which means really that 96% of global emissions come from countries who are active members of the treaty. The behavioral impact of the treaty is very, very considerable, and it is measured by the national domestic policies that have been developed and sometimes also implemented around the world. And before I proceed in discussing those in particular, which I think are really crucial in understanding where the world seems to be heading, we also have a third metric of the impact of the agreement, and that is the environmental metric. And I will spare you the suspense and essentially say that currently, under the existing national pledges, the Paris Agreement is not going to meet its target of keeping the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. Emissions keep rising approximately by 1.5% per year, not counting the pandemic times. And as a result, the environmental results are severely lacking, because even if all the current promises and pledges are fulfilled, we are going to be heading into a world of at least 2.7 degrees temperature rise, and some estimate come up with 3.9 degrees, which is truly apocalyptic, actually. With that grim picture in mind, it is important to understand that over the previous decade, there has been a tremendous policy change around the world in how governments are behaving in this area. Consider that in 2007, these are the countries in dark blue who had any kind of climate legislation. That means basically legislated policies for mitigation and emission reductions in particular. So clearly the minority. 5 years later, in 2012, the map looked considerably different, with a clear increase in the number of countries, with the notable exception of Canada, which was the only country that actually went in the opposite direction of actually tearing down its existing legislation. But by 2017, it was now clear that the majority of countries had some domestic plans in action. And by 2018, 89% of global emissions were actually covered by NDCs, by national plans. So we're seeing, in a span of a very short 10 years, a remarkable evolution in climate policies around the world, at least on paper. When it comes to the emissions, the global emissions continue to rise slowly, but it is peculiar that many of the major economies have actually seen their emissions decline compared to 2005 levels. And those include the United States, Japan, and Germany. So clearly, we see some change over time. I'd like to focus the audience's attention particularly on the recent policy developments, because in the past 9 months, this has been a very, very exciting area to follow, with phenomenal announcements, some of them having come completely unexpectedly. In September of last year, China, speaking at the General Assembly, made the shocking announcement out of the blue that they're going carbon neutral by the middle of the 21st century. Only 4 weeks later, Japan made the same announcement, followed by Korea in the same week. Today, all of the major economies, including the United States, have declared plans to decarbonize their economy by mid-century. Decarbonization is usually framed in terms of net zero emissions. And during the Q&A session, if there are any question about what that exactly means, we can engage in that technical conversation. Out of the 20 countries in the G20, all of them have carbon pricing schemes in place, except for Australia and India. And then finally, in the transportation sector, I believe not coincidentally, the countries that plan to replace all of the regular cars with the internal combustion engine with electric vehicles by the mid-century are growing in numbers and include the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Norway, and Sweden. The recent announcements from Asia came long after the European Union had committed to decarbonizing its economy and completing a transition to a clean economy. The EU has been clearly the leader in this, particularly within the industrialized world. What is astonishing is that, number one, their policy thrust is very consistent over the decades. And number two, more importantly, that over time, it is accelerating. They keep increasing the emission targets. It used to be 25%, then it was 30%, then it was 40%. And now recently, they announced that they're going for 55% emission reductions by 2030. And of course, there are also other numbers related to renewable energy and energy efficiency. The EU had declared a climate neutrality goal very early, and it was officially made in 2018. Now, let me pause for a second, because the next point is a particularly important one. And that was essentially hidden from public view for many, many years. For more than a decade, the audience perceived the EU as an environmental leader, as an actor who is concerned with climate changes and is moving in that direction because of that. But in fact, the major driver of the European ambitious climate and energy policy has to do with economic interests. The Europeans expect that the policies that they're putting in place are going to cause an increase in their GDP by 2% per year, because they think that that is actually going to help them save money and make their economy more competitive on a global, in the global context. To be more specific, they expect savings of 2 to 3 trillion euro from the reduction of oil imports by the middle of the century. In addition to that, they expect savings of 200 billion euro per year from healthcare costs related to also local air pollution. And I remember lecturing in 2006, 2007, and 2008, when I was making this argument that economic interests are driving the European leadership, and students were completely puzzled and, in disbelief. But it was in 2008 for the first time that this rationale appeared in a European document. And by 2017, the European Council very publicly was basically saying that the Paris Agreement and climate policy are absolutely essential for the modernization of the economy. China is moving in the same direction, a little bit later, a little bit slower. Their goals right now are a stabilization of emissions by 2030. Their emissions keep rising, but not with the same pace as before. They also plan to reduce their carbon intensity by up to 65%, again by 2030. And with their recent announcement that they're going to be going carbon neutral, not climate neutral, but carbon neutral by 2060. What is stunning about China is that in 2018, they actually changed their constitution to include provisions that they are going to build a quote unquote ecological civilization by 2035. That is both in the constitution as well as in the most recent 5-year plan that guides their economic development. One thing that we know from within diplomatic circles, China has a very solid reputation of a country that always does what it promises. They take forever to make a public announcement, but once they have made it, it is pretty much guaranteed that they're doing it. Their course of action has also been fairly consistent when it comes to investment. They have steadily increased their investments in renewable energy over the years, from non-existent in 2003 to a very impressive leadership, undisputed leadership at the global level today. And it's not just China. This also matches a global trend in the growth of investments in clean energy. And this global trend continues and was actually even accelerated during the pandemic. Despite the absolute collapse of the energy demand, global energy demand, because of the lockdowns, the only thing that went up was actually investments, as well as demand, as well as supply of renewable energy. And for the first time in history last year, renewable energy investments actually surpassed oil investments globally. Speaking of oil investments, they decreased not only during the lockdown and the pandemic, but between 2014 and 2016, they actually declined by 1/3. This, again, is sort of compatible with also what money governments are spending and where they're spending it. The G20 subsidies for fossil fuels also declined by 1/2 between 2013 and 2017. And so, in conclusion, it seems that major developments around the world that are political, social, and economic, both in the government realm and in the economy and the private sectors, seem to be pointing in the same direction. They converge to what appears to be a global green shift and an effort to make a transition to a clean economy. We have a very clear geographical proliferation of clean development policies, but also, notably, an acceleration of these policies. That many countries, once they establish them, they just increase their ambition over time. I don't think that we can say that it is the entire industrialized world, but certainly Asia and Europe are committed to that transition to a clean economy. The environmental results are indeed insufficient and lacking, but in my view, that will paradoxically actually lead to higher policy ambition, because what is inbuilt in the Paris Agreement is a global review in 2023, and then such global reviews every 5 years afterwards. And logically, when we know that the policies are not going to bring the desired environmental results, the political pressure on governments to increase their policies and ambitions is actually going to go higher. And with this, I want to sort of once again emphasize that currently 126 countries, which account for 51% of global emissions, have declared that they're decarbonizing by the middle of the century. And that was before the Biden administration's announcement. And so what that really suggests is that the move towards a clean energy transition is irreversible. And the main policy implication that I can draw from this analysis is that if any modern society focuses on its economic interests, a key priority would be the need to diversify the economy as well as to diversify the energy mix. I would like to draw your attention to the policy brief that Adam mentioned at the beginning, which is available through the website of the Energy Policy and Management Center of the Ivey Business School. This is a fairly comprehensive overview of all these developments. In the 20 minutes that I have today, I could only provide some basic highlights, but there's a lot of data and useful information in this publication. And I hope that it is very useful to you. And I look forward very much to Gord's comments as well as to questions and from the audience. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rado. And just to say, it's been such an inspiration watching yourself and others take on this challenge of climate policy development internationally and have the breakthrough in Paris that it was, because it is a dramatic shift in ambition. And I would share that it's a pledge and review approach, which in the earlier days of climate negotiations was viewed as too uncertain and not hard-edged enough. In other words, it was not strict compliance and enforcement to reduction obligations. That architecture of equitable allocation of reduction obligations led to behaviors that actually eroded ambition. Just for reflection, because it was like negotiating equitable allocation of pain. The equity is in the eyes of the beholder, and countries wanted to avoid it in order to at least ensure compliance with a commitment. So think of this as a shift of architecture that is driven by opportunity, more by equitable allocation of pain. And in that regard, what we've also seen is the impact of this agreement on how investors view climate risk. And it's being recognized now in the valuation of firms and in investment strategies in ways that it wasn't previously, or it was very ambiguous to imagine it. And that in turn is leading companies to take on pledges that are also more ambitious, many signing on to pledging net zero by 2030 or 2050. So as we reflect on how does this translate to the business world, I would just say it's game on. But having also said that the ambition is far more evident and increasing within the entire business world. Net zero pledges are easy. Full integration into enterprise strategies and resource allocation decision-making is hard, because in many respects, because this involves energy transition on a scale that we've never undertaken, that it involves changes in business models, not just in compliance with reduction obligations. So in that respect, this energy transition journey that we're going to be on, it affects everyone in massive ways, right from the household levels, right to regions and provinces like Alberta, which of course is where I can comment most fully, because I was on the panel, the Andrew Leach panel that developed the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan. But it's affecting regions, countries, Canada very much in the forefront of this, with reconciling the dilemma of being an oil producer with the Paris reduction obligations. And so I would just reflect that energy transitions are both exciting and scary, but they're almost always messy. And I would expect we're going to see some unanticipated consequences that are at play here. One report I would just refer our audience to is the IEA report in middle of May on net zero by 2050. And one of the bottom line messages of that report is the mission critical nature of minerals as we electrify mobility. And we have to increase minerals production massively to accommodate for the shift from hydrocarbon-based fuels to electricity-based technologies. And that's a factor that hasn't fully been examined, because mines are great, but nobody wants them in their backyard. So it's again one of these knock-on effects that we'll have to be very conscious of. I would just also share, because I'm coming at this as well from an oil and gas producer background, but you're seeing technology and innovation accelerating, not just in that sector with carbon capture and utilization and hydrogen, but also in even different non-combustion uses of hydrocarbons, like carbon fiber. And so you're going to see innovation throughout the entire value chain, from how energy is produced to how it's used. And energy technology and innovation more broadly is capital intensive, and cycle times typically have tended to be long. I remind people it's not like apps where you can make a mistake and then quickly go to the next one. This involves big capital projects, big equipment, big pots and kettles. And will there be patient capital to fund this technology and innovation element of the Paris Agreement, I think is a really important question. And so with that, I'll open up to the question and answers. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Really interesting sort of positioning of this topic here. We've got some questions that have started coming in through the Q&A, and just a reminder to the crowd as well, please use the Zoom functionality for the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your window to push questions out that I can pose. So I'm going to start off with sort of maybe a big picture question here, right? So, we've made lots of promises in the past. We've set lots of targets. What's different today, post Paris, post hopefully the pandemic, as opposed to where we were, 20, 25 years ago even? Just a softball that I'll throw to Rado, you want to take that first?
Yeah, certainly, yes. The pandemic has turned the world upside down in so many ways. There has never been such a reduction in global emissions in modern history. This was not intentional. It was simply a byproduct of the sudden drop in the demand for energy and energy use. And so it was quite serendipitous, I believe. But one very interesting twist is that because it actually happened for whatever reason, some governments became encouraged to keep it that way, and they decided to invest considerably into an economic recovery package that actually focuses on renewable energy, because there's an argument coming from Europe and other corners of the world that the pandemic is actually a great opportunity to just jump that ship. And one very interesting data I came across that is not included in the policy brief is that the economic recovery package that China is using includes investments in renewables that are 5 times more than investments in coal and other fossil fuels. It's a 5-to-1 ratio. Now, because we do have to discuss Canada today, in Canada, there's also a recovery package. There's also government spending on fossil fuels and renewable energy, and the ratio is exactly the opposite, literally like 5-to-1 ratio against renewables. But on a global scale, there's something very interesting happening. Adam, at the same time, I just want to complete my comment by saying that the pandemic makes it very, very difficult to calculate what is really going on. And I think that it is fair to say that if we didn't have a pandemic, if we had had simply the status quo, there's still a very clear evolution over time, at least in declaration, at least in declaratory policies. Thank you.
Gordon?
Well, in terms of what's different, Adam, I would reflect that in the earlier days of climate negotiations, environment ministers were clearly the ones who had the file, and they were in the chair as the head of delegations. Nowadays, it was a really big signal for business and for even for myself when you see energy ministers and finance ministers all of a sudden being part of those delegations. In fact, you could say the gravity has shifted to those ministries and those core ministries to drive the internal government agenda. The other big shift to me has been carbon pricing, and so it's been a bit of a wild ride. But we can see in Canada, just as an example, we're going from $40 a ton to $170 a ton by 2030. And as carbon pricing starts to become a reality, it's changing everything. So if we say what is the proof of that, it is follow the money and where the investment's gone. As Rado said, for the first time, renewable energy has surpassed oil and gas for capital investment, and that's a shift of gravity that I think is playing out now. It was always imagined, but it's real now.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Rado, did you want to chime back in on that point?
I would like to actually play devil's advocate and take, just for fun, the opposite view also, contrary to what I just had been saying. I think there are also plenty of science to read that suggests that, in fact, some of these policies are either not ambitious or they're just lip service, they're not really being implemented. And I couldn't help noticing in the Q&A, one of the attendees asked, what about the call by the International Energy Agency to increase production of oil, I assume. I also feel that it is fair to say, from a purely scholarly perspective, that we should not stereotype and simplify an incredibly complicated situation on a global scale. This is a vastly multifaceted process. And even if there is a transformation towards a clean economy or towards, it is of such magnitude that such process can only progress in fits and starts, There will be all kinds of mixed signals, and I think it will be confusing to the public who is paying attention. But there also could be reversals of policy. A new government in any country can come in and reverse policies, as they have done in Australia a number of times. So it's very important to keep in mind this balanced perspective on a very, very difficult and complicated situation. Having said that, I would still maintain that overall, the trajectory is very clear and unambiguous.
So sort of along this lines of this conversation here, Rado, in your presentation, you discussed Article 6, right? And that this was, somewhat of a failure of not being able to pass an international emissions trading scheme, right?
Yes.
Do you see us moving more towards that in Glasgow coming up in November, or even moving on as more countries have, or jurisdictions, let's say, subnational jurisdictions have signed up to some sort of carbon pricing scheme?
Yeah, the guess of a political scientist is as good as anybody else's.
Better than an economist, I would say.
It's not. We're not optimistic. The last time this was negotiated, it was in Madrid a couple of years ago, and Madrid broke the record of the longest running conference. It went overtime. All the climate conferences go overtime, but this one went overtime by 72 hours. And what kept everybody busy for another 3 days and 3 nights was precisely Article 6. And despite that, there was no progress. And so I think that it is fair to be somewhat skeptical about the prospect of Glasgow, but we'll have to see.
Yes, and I would just add to that, Adam, that we're looking at an oil world where there's current speculation that it could spike to $100 a barrel. Okay, at the same time, there's also a point of view that says that oil will be so surplus with the lower demand of the post-Paris world that it's going to be $20. Somewhere in the middle there is going to be reality. But just to say at $100 a barrel, that can be upsetting to political governments. Voters get angry about high energy prices. And back to Rado's point about volatility, there can be these wild card developments that have ripple effects that can be detrimental.
So we've had a couple of questions here in the Q&A about support for renewable energy, right? And that's something that we've seen, to some degree, definitely here in Ontario, and now we're seeing maybe a broader support. What do you guys see is with regards to sort of public policy support for that type of transition to renewables in the near future? And perhaps, Rado, you could speak to whether or not this plays itself into these negotiations and the discussions around that.
The answer about the question about the negotiations has a very clear answer. We don't really discuss renewables investments very often in the talks because the fundamental presumption is that every government is free to use whatever policy instruments they want to use. And we stay away from that so that nobody feels pressured to use a particular policy tool, such as investments in renewables. But I understand that in the investment world, this has been one of the biggest phenomena of the last 2 decades, right? I mean, so many people have gotten rich from that. And so I think that I will be bold here in saying that since the world seems to be clearly heading this way, only faster and faster, I think that it is essential for Canadian policymakers as well as anybody in any other advanced society to think very, very carefully about the needs to diversify the energy mix and the economy as well as in general. Because if fossil fuels don't have a bright future, a country like Saudi Arabia, who is distinct in the world by the utter absence of any effort to diversify its economy, is going to be in serious trouble. There are other countries in the same region who have diversified aggressively. That is why we have this tourism in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, because they're backpedaling, and trying to survive economically long term. But I really worry about Saudi Arabia because they're not diversifying. And they're not doing anything to reduce their reliance on oil. And that is the prism through which we have to see the wisdom of observing where the world is heading and diversifying accordingly.
Okay, so here's one from the crowd for Gord, I guess, right? And we've seen many of the big players out in Alberta making net zero obligations, let's say, right? And so, what makes these commitments credible and achievable? Is this lip service, or is this, something that's actually going to be executed upon and goals being met? And I guess maybe, Rado, you could follow on, how does this then get interpreted by the policymakers or the negotiators that are seeing, corporate actors, rising up there? So Gord, what do you think about the credibility of some of these commitments?
Well, I said earlier that integrating your climate commitments, your net zero pledges into your resource allocation decision making is where the rubber really hits the road, right? What percentage of your capital budget is going to go towards these climate mitigation strategies or climate opportunity strategies? And I know Suncor just recently, and I'm not there at that table any longer, but they did commit a third of their budget. I believe their capital budget was going to go towards this transformation of their business model to lower carbon. So firms, I would look for companies to start tying capital commitments to those pledges. And back to follow the money, that's very real. And some of these also, to highlight it, there is a cost reduction innovation needed on a number of these carbon mitigation strategies, like carbon utilization and storage. But they have been commercially applied in the past. So this isn't, often it's not technologies that are pie in the sky or a field of dreams. It's technologies that are known. We just have to get economies of scale and start to get the operating costs of them down and energy intensity of them down. yeah, is there serious money? And I'd say for some firms that's the case. One thing though to also caution is that in the oil and gas world, there's an effort to also shed carbon intensive assets. Just to remind the audience, that's not emission reductions. That's just shifting the ownership of them. So the real heavy lifting is in the mitigation technology investing.
Yeah. Adam, your point about lip service is a very important one. Very clearly, there are countries who knowingly declare targets, knowing that they don't intend to really implement them. There are such countries, I would say more so in the past than today. But there are some examples. I don't think at the same time that everything can be dismissed as lip service. I can certainly say that the European Union is just genuinely committed to these policies, and there's a very deeply institutionalized process to put them in place. And a number of times they've actually overcomplied with their own pledges. Now, at the risk of being, of treading on some toes, I would say that from personal experience, you have to understand that in the European Union, there isn't a great deal of attention to Canada or even to the United States. This was one of the very interesting things that I learned in these talks, in hundreds and hundreds of hours of internal negotiations and consultations. Number one, for about 10 years, Canada basically had taken itself out of the game. And quite frankly, nobody was paying any attention to Canada. At some point, the chief negotiator for the EU said, forget about Canada. It doesn't matter what they say. There's nothing that we can do to change their minds. Their policy is entirely ideological. But the other thing that works against Canada in these diplomatic circles is that very clearly, from any objective point of view, since about 2005, we had a very long list of policy declarations and policy plans. And without fail, we have failed to implement them. On occasion, there has been zero effort to implement them. That is not a criticism. It is just a very empirical observation. Everybody knows that. And I think that the current government is trying to do something different, but even their own plans, even they acknowledge that they will not meet their own targets. The calculation of the Canadian government is that they're going to miss by at least 15 to 20%, likely 30% by 2030. And so it's just fair to say that you have to understand that some of the world is not really paying a great deal of attention to what's happening here. More interestingly, for a number of times, the US even has been neglected, because the US just is it's the most unreliable partner. I mean, they change their mind all the time. Everybody who has looked into this knows very well how the government of the American political system works. And everybody at the negotiations in the picture that you see behind me at the UN, everybody knows that the US delegation has absolutely zero ability to guarantee that what they're saying is actually what's going to happen, approved by Congress back home. And so my message in this context is, you have to understand that China and the EU, they're doing their own plans, and they're going ahead without regard to what the US will be doing.
Yeah, I would just paraphrase Rado just somewhat in saying that often the climate issue has had to be taken on in political timelines, in other words, by political governments who want to be reelected, which almost always meant the policy stringency never was sufficient to meet the pledges of outcomes that have been made. And I think it is a very outstanding and important question as to whether we can get climate to where it falls outside of that political timeline world and takes on a commitment that has sustained political support. You know, it was encouraging, at least within Canada, of seeing the Conservative Party now recognizing carbon pricing in a little more favorable manner that hasn't, that, but if it gets politicized constantly, it's not good for business either.
Mm. Can I just follow up on this and also say that personally, I'm skeptical of environmentalists because I think that in this complex world and complex economic future, I think the best course of action is really a very balanced perspective. I think it would be naive and foolish, you know, to draw a conclusion, oh yeah, the world is going to be green, we'd better just ditch everything that is dirty and just go clean. That is a very dangerous course of action. I think there has to be a very good social responsibility to the various people employed in various industries in Canada and other countries. I think the opposite is equally dangerous, to ignore these signs of a global green shift and to not plan for economic diversification. But both sides have to be really put on the scales, and I think that that would be a responsible economic planning.
Do you see policy instruments in Canada starting to be developed to get to that transition, to support those industries that, you know, perhaps will be the losers in this transition and move that ball forward?
I think so. I mean, I have spoken to top people in the oil sector of Canada, and they're genuinely worried about their own prospects. One of them told me at dinner, we just can't really market our products anymore. I think that they will require some kind of protection by the government, at least during a transition period. And I think that for now, they don't have any reasons to worry because the government has clearly shown that they will support the existing industries in the energy sector. Again, we're dealing with what is likely to be the most fundamental and complicated socioeconomic transformation in history. And so it is very, very difficult to predict what is going to happen, how quickly it's going to happen. And so all these are open questions.
But Adam, I would add one little case study into the Canadian mix, and it is coal phase out in Alberta. And you know, that the province of Alberta has coal that was pennies a ton. I mean, it's almost free to make use of thermal coal there. The plants were just physically located right on top of the mines. But we do have an open supply system for competitive bidding on new supply in the province. But with carbon pricing, we're actually going to see an accelerated phase out of coal in Alberta. And the renewable mix is going to go to probably over 30%. We'd declared 30%, but the cost competitiveness is now such that it's probably going to go higher. And natural gas, of course, was the other transition choice being made. But to see coal phase out done in an accelerated fashion has been a positive.
So a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask you guys for some final comments and we'll wrap up, right? But, you know, in other areas of international negotiation, like trade policy, right? Enforcement and dispute resolution is seen as the teeth that keeps countries, let's say, honest and engaged with the process. Can you foresee a situation where we have those types of mechanisms or something that emulates that in the environmental world?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just chip in of saying border carbon adjustments now seem to be all of a sudden on the radar in a bigger way. They've always been there as an element of climate policy, but you really see, I think, at the G7, they're being surfaced in a much more explicit manner, and it's a tool that be careful what you ask for, because it would make trade disputes and tariff wars pale in comparison. But Rado, what's your views on border carbon adjustments?
I think that a lot of this will be done on a bilateral level, because in international law, the fundamental principles are sovereign freedom of governments. And almost by definition, most treaties have very weak compliance provisions. What that means in plain language is that there are very few of the thousands of treaties that were negotiated that actually stipulate very harsh penalties for countries who fail to comply and implement. Scholars of international law would tell us that it is self-enforcing. And indeed, most of the time countries tend to comply, or at least try. And the reason for that are many, but in our context, I would draw your attention to what I said earlier about the economic motivation of what is driving these policies. China and the EU are going to go ahead, not just to be good world citizens in international law and comply with the treaty, but because there are very tangible economic benefits that they're going after.
So I'm just going to ask you guys each to offer up a last comment on this, right?
Yeah.
You know, where do you see global climate negotiation going? Where do you see Canada's role in that heading? And, you know, it seems like we may be going into an election season in the next 6 months, right? And this may be on the table there as well. You know, Rado, do you want to kick off? Where do you see as sort of the direction here that we're going?
Certainly. I think that internationally, we're not going anywhere in particular, because I don't think that we can expect anything truly exciting related to the Paris Agreement in the next 5 years. The treaty is done. You know, the book is closed in a certain sense. Yes, of course, we'll have to negotiate Article 6, but the foundation is laid, and they worked so hard to do it that they're not doing anything new again for the foreseeable future. So my message is, don't expect too much from climate diplomacy, and anything particularly interesting other than international emissions trading and a global carbon price. That will be the interesting development. So what I think where Canada has to focus is not internationally, but domestically. And again, it depends on who is in power. But I think that the effort to reduce emissions will continue. The effort to focus on renewables will continue. And I think that regardless of the pace of that development, the direction is very clear. I just hope that the policymakers in Canada, both in the provinces and at the federal level, will have, first of all, up-to-date information about what is happening, because the global context is very important in trying to understand what we have to do. And number two, to exercise the responsibility, for a balanced and astute economic planning that matches those times.
Yeah, and Adam, I would just share that what I'm watching for is a term I'll use called carbon competitiveness. So in other words, the pace and the scale of which technology and innovation starts to occur, and that disruption happens. And because I think for governments and policymakers, I think of that world as creating the framework conditions. But I always look at someone like Elon Musk. When Trump came into power in the US and completely blew up all the climate policy efforts, he didn't care, right? Those disruptors and those innovators, they just carry forward. And if they know what the long game is, and the signals are right, then it puts me in a more optimistic view, I guess would be a way of ending things, that I think we'll underestimate the pace at which technology and innovation occurs, and watch where capital goes along with that. Thanks.
Great. Well, I think that's a great end to today's webinar. I'd really like to thank our panelists for joining us here today, for Rado writing that policy brief. I'd encourage all our participants to check it out, and thank everyone for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Laura McLeod, our center's coordinator, that helped to make today's webinar possible. And last statement I'd just like to say is that our center is committed to continue to be an independent, informed, and trusted voice on energy issues in Canada. We hope that you continue to seek out our research and the events that we'll continue to have well into summer and come the fall time. So everyone have a great day.